Post-traumatic stress disorder is about difficulty forgetting. So it's become stuck. The person can't let things go. And so as they go through life and very simple, mundane things happen, what happens to the person with post-traumatic stress disorder is they get triggered and they have essentially a meltdown. So do people on the autism spectrum experience post-traumatic stress disorder? It's obvious that some people with autism are extremely highly emotional and have a very high tendency to meltdowns or tantruming or panic attacks. It's very obvious that some people with autism have the inability to forget and are constantly replaying often traumatizing events that they've experienced. They'll always replay the troubling events that they may have had. In some people with autism. If you tend towards depression, this may be even higher. And depression is, again, something very common in people with autism. There are certain personality traits like avoidant personality disorder, those very shy, routine-oriented people who have a higher tendency to generalized anxiety disorder, school phobias, separation anxiety disorder, selective mutism, things very commonly seen on the autism spectrum. And these people will have a far greater tendency towards depression and anxiety. And if they have that type of memory that can't forget, then you have essentially quite a recipe for people developing post-traumatic stress disorder under the type of conditions that will happen. So what are those conditions? And why would they happen to somebody with autism? Well, number one, people with autism are born into all kinds of families. They might be born into a family that has no domestic violence. They might be born into a family that is rife with domestic violence. They might be born into a family where there's no substance abuse. They might be born into one where there is, and all the unpredictable and often traumatizing behaviors that will come with that. In fact, there are people on the autism spectrum who will then have children who are on the autism spectrum. And some of those adults will have issues like anger management problems, behavior management problems, mood disorders. They may have personality disorders. They may have substance abuse issues. And that doesn't mean that they don't also happen to have some autism spectrum stuff. But I think we used to live in these old days where we imagined there were these wonderful little well-adjusted non-autistic parents who happen to occasionally have an autistic child, and so certainly those parents couldn't ever have the kind of issues that could lead to post-traumatic stress disorder in their child. In fact, there obviously are some parents on and off the spectrum who have those kind of issues and who also have children on the spectrum. Another reason why kids with autism can develop post-traumatic stress disorder is bullying. And 90% of kids on the autism spectrum have experienced persistent bullying. Some of them have experienced it for years, and some have experienced it to the degree they've developed a range of mental health issues: depression, chronic anxiety, agoraphobia, social phobia, extreme poor self-esteem, related self-harm or substance abuse issues. And many of the adults are still trying to deal with or are in therapy for bullying issues that happen to them in school, anywhere from mid-primary school, late primary school, and certainly secondary school, and for some of them in the workplace. So does post-traumatic stress disorder highly overlap with being on the autism spectrum? Yes. Do people with post-traumatic stress disorder experience sudden triggers that set them off into complete panic? Yes. Do people with post-traumatic stress disorder struggle to stay aware that they're in the present rather than be reacting as if they were back in that past situation? Yes. Does that mean all people with autism have post-traumatic stress disorder? No. Does it mean that people with autism may have a higher rate of post-traumatic stress disorder than the general population? My view is probably. So let's take a look at the more extreme state of post-traumatic stress disorder, such as dissociative identity disorder. So here we're talking about a condition where the source of the trauma was before that person was 3 to 6 years old. Now, a lot of kids with autism will have been looked after fairly well before they were 3 to 6 years old, but not all of them will have. Some of them will have grown up in care homes. Some of them will have been at-risk children born to parents who for whatever reason were unable to cope or manage their own behaviour and were some kind of ongoing danger to the child. If they were born to a parent who had personality disorders, they may, or had substance abuse issues, they may have been abused in a whole range of ways in an ongoing manner. If this happened to somebody who was already quite good at dissociation, who already had a significantly high level of exposure anxiety and chronic avoidance, diversion and retaliation responses, if this happened to somebody who already was very good at losing themselves into being the cat, being the dog, being the TV character, then chances are that that person is going to be more vulnerable to developing something like dissociative identity disorder alongside of what was already their autism. So are there people with dissociative identity disorder who have autism? Yes. I know of at least a dozen people diagnosed on the autism spectrum who are also diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. I know far more on the autism spectrum who are diagnosed with the lesser version of the dissociative disorders, which is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And there are certainly even far more people with autism, if not a majority of people with autism, who commonly experience a much higher level of dissociation, depersonalization and derealization than people in the general population. And that's to be expected where people are experiencing any degree of chronic stress and have a high level of social isolation, where their opportunities in life, their opportunities to get out of their own head and to get over various anxieties is not as many opportunities perhaps as in the non-autistic population.
I find this to be rather interesting. A self-state. And this does not need to be negative. It is really being centered in yourself. That can be a very good thing. And that's not the same as selfish or solipsism, but rather having roots. Once you know who you are, you have a center.
Still be splitting into a range of different identities that helps you to manage extreme chronic stress. You can be somebody who may have, say, Asperger's, and you might have difficulty reading facial expression, body language, intonation. You might be fairly obsessive compulsive as a personality and fixated on detail and very about control and go to the nth degree in all your interests, which you might commonly see in Asperger's. You might also be quite dyspraxic and have your your clumsiness and information processing issues associated with a lack of neurological integration, and that will not stop you from also defensively and involuntarily having this hair trigger response where you compartmentalize different parts of your life and you deal with them as different identities. And that doesn't mean most people on the autism spectrum are going to experience DID. Unlike post-traumatic stress disorder, which can happen far more commonly to people, DID is really reserved for those who've had severe chronic abuse, neglect, trauma before the age of 3 to 6 years old. So if a person with autism was not constantly put through that during the time where they are developing identity, chances are they won't later manifest as having dissociative identity disorder. Another of the reasons why somebody with autism may develop DID may be something like where they've had intensive therapy, and this may be constant medical intervention. It may be that they've felt constantly assaulted by having to take things that taste disgusting or make them nearly choke. They may hate all the needles. They may hate constantly seeing doctors and feeling abused by constant testing. They may feel, they may remember having been pinned down by therapists. They may remember being locked in their room and having, not being allowed to move from the seat or use the toilet until they'd completed the ABA task to the liking of the therapist. They may remember being constantly filmed and filmed and filmed in their bedroom 24/7 by a bunch of therapists who they then continually hear talking about them as if they were a case. Now, whilst for a parent, that may mean, hang on a minute, I spent $60,000 buying that stuff each year. For the person who's experiencing it, that doesn't mean they didn't find that as severely chronically traumatizing. So just because something is wonderful to a carer doesn't mean that the child understood it, appreciated it, or experienced it with their soul intact. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens is if somebody's doing that with their child to try to cure their autism, the more that the person continues to dissociate, to experience depersonalization, derealization, and splitting, and unable to stay on track, to relax in their body, to connect and identify with their own hands, their own communication, the more the parents stay on the case and keep throwing the same type of potentially traumatizing treatments at a child who's already obviously emotionally not coping. And one of the reasons they do this is because instead of seeing a child who's not coping, they see the autism. Instead of seeing a child who is in a breakdown state, they see low functioning. So I think we have to be very careful about how we hide behind some of the labels and some of the things that we do because we feel that we're helping, and some of the ways in which the services are like a supermarket. And if you have enough money, and you're desperate enough, some families will go in there almost like a glutton and buy everything and throw it at a very young child who emotionally and socially, even sensorily, is not equipped to handle this type of behavior around them for 40 hours a week, day in, day out. So while some personalities can cope with that, others may not. While some may benefit dramatically, others may actually stagnate and not be able to develop under those circumstances. Sometimes what we think is, the food turns out to be the poison. And sometimes what works for one child is actually the very worst thing that you could do with another. So it doesn't mean that therapy was a bad thing. It just meant you needed to read the signs and stop calling it the autism. If the person is in a breakdown state and isn't able to cope and is becoming more dissociative, more anxious, developing more disturbing behaviours as a result of the therapy? If so, why are you not winding it back? Who are the gurus in your ears that are making you continue to invest in bombarding a child with more than they can handle? Were the medical interventions necessary? Sometimes, yes. Were there ways of doing them less invasively? Perhaps. Were there ways of offsetting the damage of this level of invasion? I mean, for example, where was the silliness? Where was the rough and tumble? Where was the reminder of the person that this was not the only perspective people had? So if a child didn't feel they were also a person and also engaged at some level with things that they enjoyed, if all that was taken away because it was too autistic, and then all they got given was a bunch of tests, injections, and tablets and therapists, then it wouldn't be surprising that any human being would crack under those circumstances. And certainly a child who is under the age of 6, who is not yet fully formed their own identity, it wouldn't be at all surprising if they were to fragment and compartmentalise, so that later on what you saw was extreme swinging from one version of the child to another version of the child, and often equally dysfunctional. You may even see several versions of that same child and think, is this person possessed? They're behaving as if they're possessed. And I've heard as an autism consultant from clients who say it's like they are two children, or it's like there's some different children in that one person. When they come to school, they are like this. When they're at home, they're like that. When they're with this sibling, they behave like this, and then they're completely different in that situation. And whilst that's normal, that's a very normal thing to have different parts of your personality come together under different circumstances. If you have that so extremely that in each place, in certain places, the person is a danger to themselves or a danger to others, then clearly that's the level, the volume level, is indicating there's a significant problem.
And from my experience, the better you know yourself, the more you start caring. Once you have identified yourself, then
you can do that work non-verbally. You can do that work through typing. You can do that work through objects. You can do that work through mind maps. You can do that work through characterizations. You can do that work through an indirectly confrontational approach. But the most important thing is that you really can't do that work whilst you're contributing to the same condition. So if you're already contributing to the person's dissociation, depersonalization, derealization, if you're continuing to contribute to the person's post-traumatic stress disorder, if you're continuing to contribute to the person's splitting within dissociative identity disorder, then you clearly can't solve the problem that you're contributing to. And that is really one of the most important things about DID, is you really do have to help the person to get into a different kind of environment, one that is not continuing to feed the problem. With DID, with something like that, it often doesn't show itself in a very comprehensible way until the person is an adult. And yet when you look back, you can still see in early childhood that this was more than one person or more than one identity. Yes, people can appear to have learned to function as different parts of them, and then as an adult that will all break down and get out of control. One of the other examples with DID is people who were not developmentally at the level that they were pushed into, and there are some people on the autism spectrum who have said that they developed a non-autistic self. so they couldn't integrate it with their autistic self. They felt that they had to create an identity that could exist and not be victimized among the non-autistic population. And they may have done this when they first went to primary school. They may have began doing this in kindergarten. And so whilst we promote integration, social integration, we also need to keep in mind that there may be a level at which people emotionally can or can't cope. It doesn't mean pull them out of those situations, because social integration is really important. What it does mean is balancing things up so that they don't feel impossibly trapped in that situation, and they don't feel that the rest of who they are is completely invalidated. And that doesn't mean take them home and constantly reinforce, you're a naughty, you're a naughty, you're a naughty. No. Reinforce their personhood. Reinforce their freedom to be the individual that they are. That may happen to be an autistic individual, but none of us are labels. We're not a walking autism package. None of us. No matter how much you feel somebody fits the poster child of autism, the fact is, all of us have our own personality. All of us have a right to an integrated identity. I think the other thing to mention about dissociative disorders and the autism spectrum is that although DID was once called multiple personality disorder, it's actually not a personality disorder at all in the DSM-5. So multiple personality disorder is now defunct. It's discredited. There's no such thing as a multiple personality. There are people who have many personality traits, and we all do. And any of those personality traits can become so extreme they get called a personality disorder, like avoidant personality disorder, or schizoid personality disorder, or schizotypal personality disorder, for example. And all of those personality disorders may commonly overlap with dissociative disorders. But that doesn't mean that a dissociative disorder is a personality disorder. So you can have with or without, and have autism too. So I hope that that has clarified the quite holistic picture of the interconnectedness between something like autism as an information processing disorder, a collection of sensory perceptual disorders, associated communication disorders, underpinning physical disorders like gut immune metabolic disorders. Some of the fallout of that are various mood, anxiety, compulsive disorders, and how dissociative disorders can be one of the strategies that has got out of hand in certain types of personalities, but also is more likely in people who are dealing with significant information processing issues in a world they find overly invasive, particularly if they have been over-therapized and have taken that perhaps as chronic social invasion. So I think that without sounding like I'm anti-therapy, and I'm not anti-therapy, I think we still need to acknowledge that people's souls are fragile, and we need to not mollycoddle that or overprotect that, because that in itself is a harm of its own. But what we do need to do is to respect that and to keep our eyes open and our hearts open, and don't let your head be filled by a million gurus who convince you to go bull at a gate with a child who's not even their child. Feel the situation and do what feels respectful. And I'm 51 years old, and I'm going through integration now. There's over 14 in my team, and I left the body essentially depersonalized, dissociated from the body, from my mind, from emotions when I was before the age of 2. I do remember being 4 years old and having a moment in the body where I was standing outside my parents' door and unable to move, and couldn't work out how I got there because I had never learned to walk, and here I was outside their door. So other parts of me were around at least since I was 2 years old, and those parts of me were essentially running the body on my behalf in my absence. They include all kinds of different parts of me, parts of me that stayed being littles, one who only began really getting the beginnings of functional speech after I returned, and I returned to the body when I was 47 years old. And what woke me up was that I was always the typist. So the only sort of thing that I really was present in was the fingers typing that allowed as a conduit other parts of me to express their world. So that was my skill. My skill was I'm a very fast typist. But I didn't want to take anything personally. I didn't take anything as about me. I felt that I was some kind of ghost who was allowing their lives to be typed. And after the typing, that was it. So that I felt kind of like a stenographer, like a translator. And I felt like I knew of all these other lives, full lives, emotional lives, lives with investment in what they liked, what they didn't like, who they were attached to, who they weren't, who they identified with, who they didn't, what kind of things suited their personality frameworks. They have different genders, different ages, they had different sexual orientations. One was Italian. They have very different skill sets. So very different collections of parts of me. And they ran my life for a long, long time. And in 2010, the part of me that was hosting my team, which was Willie, was seeing a counsellor, but went for a medication review with a psychiatrist. And at the medication review, the psychiatrist diagnosed DID and also diagnosed Willie as having schizoid personality disorder, which is true of that particular part of me. So I was, if you ask how aware was I at that point, like someone who's sleeping in the other room, or sleepwalking in a back room, who is taking things in but not consciously aware they're taking anything in, and who is, that's kind of where it was at. So it took a long, long time for me to, in 2010, of course, Willie was, now the team was diagnosed, we were diagnosed as a person with DID, and we started really intensive work on helping each of those parts to become as well adjusted as possible and address all this stuff, because each part was not only a compartmentalized part of me, but had contained and managed very different parts of trauma and loss, neglect, trauma, loss, various stuff. And so they didn't all have the same life story. They had pieces of one life story, but to them that piece was, those pieces were the whole. And it's like very different lenses, people with very different lenses looking through those at their own lives, even though they're actually all sharing a body. So as being their typist, and I'm typing out their lives throughout this process, I started to shake, I started to cry, and I thought, oh my, I'm actually not a ghost. I'm in the body. How can I be in the body if I'm just some ghost who happens to possess it and allow typing to happen? I guess that's how deep the sense of avoidance of my own life was, and the sense of denial of my own existence and my own mind and my own emotions. How unsafe it was to have a body, to have a mind, to have emotions, and how long it took to be ready to wake up, I guess, and what it took to wake up. So once I began to wake up, I started to say, what is this and how did this happen? And I thought, my alters thought that I was a minor alter and that they were much more important alters than me, because I had basically never really done much at all except a bit of typing. And I therefore thought of myself as very insignificant, and I soon realised that I had abilities that they didn't have. So I became, yes, I was always the conduit, the channel through which they could all type, but I seemed to become the fruit bowl and they were all the fruit. So I became this one who was able to connect everybody up and help them to negotiate stuff with each other. And it was very, very different to having a host. So Willie would, kind of shove people into line, but being an alter that was taking charge like a protector. And I wasn't like this. I was like a house parent to all these different parts of me, but it was like I'd been absent and I had to handle the responsibility of having saved my own butt by making myself absent. And after, let me see, well, I guess it's been 5 years now of me being present, learning how to reuse the body, learning to get into my voice, because at first I had such a bad stammer and a lot of selective mutism on top of that. I thought, oh no, I can't speak. But I did progressively become able to do that, which was with the help of at least two of the alters prompting and basically giving me my own lines of what I wanted to say, and so I could follow it. Eventually, by the end of about a year, I was able to speak as fluently as anyone in my team. I kept splitting, kept associating. It was very, very hard to stay in the body because it was my skill. My skill was leave the body, leave the mind, leave the emotions. So for a long time, yes, I was the fruit bowl, but I was a fruit bowl who kept wandering off. And luckily, my team really was glad to have someone running the ship. All these parts of me were very glad that there was someone finally here to take charge, but not as an alter, but as where they had come from. And yeah, so that was really humbling to have these parts of me that had run my life and yet forgave me for absenting my life. It took a lot longer to, first of all, give them the lives that they each needed and help them to understand each other, to really gain respect and kindness and pride in each other, helping them to form connections, strong connections with different parts of the team. I guess like sisterhoods, twinships, cousinhood sort of stuff within the team, instead of feeling completely unrelated. Well, a lot of them were so unrelated. And then over time, I started to feel, hey, I've been the house parent. I wouldn't mind actually having a life. I wouldn't mind actually doing some things that I think I now like. I think that I'm interested in. And so I started taking part in my own life, not just for all the parts of me, but for me, for the fruit bowl.